They noticed her the moment she stepped inside, not because she was remarkable, but because she so clearly didn't belong. The room was a cathedral of wealth, crystal chandeliers dripping light onto marble floors imported from somewhere no one bothered to pronounce correctly, conversations floating in low, confident tones polished by generations of money. Laughter here was effortless, practiced. Every gesture said we are safe, we are important, we are known. And then there was her. She stood near the entrance as if uncertain whether the floor beneath her feet was real. Her coat was plain, neatly pressed but unmistakably modest. No designer logo announced her arrival. No assistant hovered nearby. Her shoes were practical, clean, well-kept, and entirely forgettable. She carried a simple leather bag, the kind chosen for durability rather than display. Someone near the champagne table tilted their head and smiled, not kindly. Another glance followed. Then another. The assessments were swift and silent, sharpened by habit. Lost. Staff? Someone's +1 mistake. A woman in emerald silk leaned toward her companion and whispered something behind a manicured hand. He smirked, eyes flicking over the stranger with mild amusement, like one might regard a curiosity accidentally tracked in from the street. A waiter paused, unsure whether to offer her a drink or ask her to leave. The simple woman felt it all, the weight of their stares, the invisible line drawn between them and her. She had felt it before, in different rooms, in different cities, always the same quiet verdict delivered without a single word spoken aloud. She did not flinch. Instead, she breathed slowly, grounding herself the way she had learned to do long ago, when rooms like this were not glittering ballrooms but hospital corridors and cramped offices with flickering lights. When numbers mattered more than names. When silence was not discomfort, but strategy. Across the room, a man with silver hair and a watch worth more than most houses frowned openly now. "Who invited her?" he murmured, not bothering to lower his voice. His tone carried the assumption of ownership, as if the space itself answered to him. No one responded. No one knew. And that uncertainty irritated them. Because in this world, everything was supposed to be accounted for. The woman took a step forward. Then another. Her posture was calm, unhurried. She did not scan the room in awe, nor did she shrink from its opulence. She moved like someone accustomed to waiting, someone who understood that timing, not permission, decided when doors truly opened. A young socialite laughed too loudly as the woman passed, the sound brittle, performative. "Confidence," she said mockingly to her friend, without the credentials. If only she knew. If any of them knew. Beneath the unremarkable fabric of the woman's coat lay a story written not in silk and champagne, but in acquisitions, quiet transfers, offshore structures, patents purchased before anyone realized their worth. Fortunes built where applause was unnecessary and anonymity was armor. $750 million does not announce itself. It waits. And as the host finally turned, confusion crossing his face while recognition began, slow, reluctant, dangerous, the room continued buzzing, unaware that the hierarchy it relied upon was already cracking, that the woman they had dismissed had the power to unmake entire legacies with a phone call she had not yet placed. And she was just beginning to decide whether this room deserved to know who she really was. The host hesitated mid-step, his polished smile faltering as though it had briefly forgotten its purpose. He looked at the woman again, this time not with dismissal, but with calculation. Something in her stillness unsettled him. People like her were supposed to fidget, to apologize with their posture. She did neither. A subtle shift rippled through the room. Conversations thinned, then resumed, thinner still, as curiosity sharpened into suspicion. Wealth had taught these people many things, but most of all it had taught them to fear what they did not immediately recognize. The woman reached the center of the hall and stopped. Not dramatically. Not for effect. Simply because this was where she chose to stand. A server approached at last, extending a flute of champagne with the careful politeness reserved for uncertainty. She accepted it with a nod, her fingers steady, her expression unreadable. The glass caught the light, briefly reflecting the chandeliers above, fractured brilliance, multiplied and distorted. She did not drink. Across the room, the man with the silver watch was no longer smiling. He leaned toward another guest, whispering urgently now. Names were exchanged. Then surnames. Then pauses. Phones emerged discreetly, screens glowing beneath tables, behind palms, inside jackets. Nothing. No social media trail. No recent photos. No scandal to anchor her to something familiar. That absence, the clean, unnerving void where a reputation should have been, began to unsettle them more than her presence ever had. She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping the room for the first time. Not searching. Measuring. The way one surveys land before deciding what to build, or what to remove. Her eyes lingered on faces that had already dismissed her, already decided her worth, cataloging them with quiet precision. A woman in diamonds straightened unconsciously. A man near the bar adjusted his cufflinks. Someone laughed again, too quickly this time. The host finally cleared his throat. "May I help you?" he asked, his voice smooth but tight, every syllable edged with ownership and restraint. The simple woman looked at him, then really looked, and something in her gaze made him feel, inexplicably, as though he had been summoned. "I believe," she said calmly, "you already are." A murmur stirred. That was not the answer expected. That was not the language of someone out of place. The host blinked. "I'm sorry, your name?" She tilted her head, considering the question as though names were optional things, useful only when necessary. Around them, the room leaned in without realizing it had done so. Even the music seemed to recede, leaving space for whatever came next. Because in that moment, before she spoke, before recognition arrived like an overdue storm, something irreversible had already begun. The balance in the room had shifted. And the people who once looked down on her were starting to sense, far too late, that they were standing on ground that no longer belonged to them. The woman did not answer immediately. Silence stretched, not awkward, but deliberate, until it pressed against the walls and forced everyone to feel it. In rooms like this, silence was usually a mistake. Tonight, it was a weapon. She raised the champagne flute just enough to acknowledge its presence, then set it down untouched on a passing tray. The faint clink of glass sounded louder than it should have. Several heads turned. "My name," she said at last, her voice even, unhurried, "has never been particularly useful in rooms that decide value before listening." A few smiles froze. Someone inhaled sharply. The host felt heat creep up his collar, though he could not have said why. "That said," she continued, "you'll find it in your records." The certainty in her tone landed differently than arrogance. It wasn't a challenge. It was a statement of fact. The man with the silver watch stiffened. His phone vibrated in his hand. He glanced down, then again, his brows knitting together. He turned slightly away, shielding the screen from view, but not before his expression shifted, confusion giving way to something sharper, something alarmed. He looked up at her. Really looked this time. And for the first time that evening, he didn't speak. Across the hall, a younger investor whispered, "I think I know her," though the words sounded more like a question than a claim. His companion shook her head quickly, eyes wide, as if afraid the woman might hear. The host forced a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," he said. "This event is curated." The woman smiled faintly, not in amusement, but in recognition. She had heard that word before. Curated. Filtered. Sanitized of unpredictability. "So was the last company I acquired," she replied softly. "Until it wasn't." That landed. A few guests exchanged looks now openly. Curiosity edged into unease. This was no longer a curiosity at the door, this was a presence that refused to be categorized. The host swallowed. If you'd care to join me privately. Not yet, she said, gently but firmly. Her gaze moved past him, toward the towering windows overlooking the city. Lights glittered below, millions of lives unfolding unseen, uninvited. She studied them the way one might study a living map. I came to observe, she continued. To see who speaks when they believe no one important is listening. A beat. And who stays silent when the numbers don't favor them. The silver watch man's phone buzzed again. This time, he didn't hide his reaction. His face drained of color. Whatever he was reading did not belong in a room built on confidence. He leaned toward the host and whispered something urgent. The host's jaw tightened. Around them, the room was still smiling, still pretending, still unaware that the woman in the plain coat had already learned everything she needed, and that the evening had only just begun to reveal who would remain standing once the truth finally surfaced. The host straightened, smoothing the front of his jacket with a hand that was no longer entirely steady. He glanced around, as if the room itself might offer guidance, but the chandeliers only reflected back 100 versions of his uncertainty. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, then stopped. The instinct to control the narrative wrestled with a newer, more dangerous instinct, the need to confirm what he suddenly feared he already knew. The woman watched him with patient interest. Behind her, a pair of older patrons murmured to one another, their voices low and urgent now. One of them, the kind of man whose name was etched on buildings, had gone very still. He, too, was scrolling. He, too, had found something that refused to stay contained. A fund. A shell company. A controlling interest acquired quietly over 18 months. The numbers didn't shout. They whispered. But they whispered ownership. The host cleared his throat again. Perhaps, he said carefully, we should move this conversation somewhere quieter. She finally turned back to him. Why? She asked. This is where people are most honest. Her words landed like a verdict. Nearby, a woman who had earlier laughed too loudly now stared into her glass as if it might offer refuge. A man at the bar set his drink down untouched, the ice clinking faintly as his hand trembled. The simple woman adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. The gesture was ordinary, almost domestic, but several people flinched, as though she had reached for something far more consequential. You see, she continued, her voice carrying without effort, there's a moment in every system where it becomes clear who benefits from silence, and who has been relying on it. The silver watch man stepped forward, unable to stop himself. What do you want? He asked, the edge in his voice failing to mask the urgency beneath. She regarded him thoughtfully. That depends, she said, on what you're willing to admit you've been avoiding. The air felt thinner now, charged. Conversations had died completely. Even the music had faded into an almost imperceptible hum, as though the room itself was holding its breath. From the far end of the hall, an assistant hurried toward the host, whispering frantically. The host's face hardened as he listened, then, slowly, inevitability set in. The woman noticed the change. She always did. She took a single step forward, just enough to reclaim the center of the room once more, and met the gazes fixed upon her, faces that had once looked down, now caught between disbelief and dawning recognition. Relax, she said quietly. I didn't come to take anything. A pause. I came to see who would offer it, long before they realized they had no other choice. No one spoke. The assurance in her voice unsettled them more than any threat could have. In this room, power was usually loud, announced through titles, benefactors, introductions spoken twice so no one missed them. Her power sat differently. It waited. The assistant leaned closer to the host again, whispering faster now, eyes darting toward the woman as if she might hear from across the hall. The host nodded once, sharply, then dismissed him with a gesture that tried, and failed, to look authoritative. He turned back to her. You're referring to assets that are complicated, he said, choosing each word with care. She smiled faintly. They always are, she replied. Right up until the moment they're not. A ripple moved through the crowd. Someone shifted their stance, another took a step back, recalibrating distance as though proximity itself carried risk. The man whose name crowned a university building loosened his tie, his jaw tight. He had stopped pretending not to listen. The woman's gaze found him. Not accusatory. Not triumphant. Simply aware. "You built something impressive," she said, almost conversationally. "Growth like that takes vision. It also takes blind spots." His lips parted, then closed. Around him, allies waited for him to speak, to reclaim control. He didn't. She let the silence sit with him. "I'm curious," she continued, turning slightly so her words carried to the room again. "How many of you have reviewed your minority stakeholders this quarter?" A few people laughed reflexively, short, nervous bursts, before realizing no one else had joined in. Phones vibrated again. This time, more of them. One after another. The sound was subtle, but multiplied, it created a quiet chorus of disruption. Screens glowed. Fingers scrolled. Faces changed. What they were seeing wasn't dramatic. No headlines. No exposés. Just confirmations. Structures. Percentages that had grown unnoticed. Voting rights quietly consolidated. Leverage waiting patiently in the margins. The woman reached into her bag at last. Several people stiffened. She withdrew not a document, not a contract, but a simple pair of reading glasses. She put them on calmly, the gesture almost gentle, and glanced around as if she were about to begin a lecture. "You've all been very busy building walls," she said. "I've spent the last decade building doors." The host exhaled slowly through his nose. "This event was meant to celebrate partnership," he said, though the word now sounded fragile. "It still can," she replied. "Partnership requires clarity." She removed the glasses, meeting his eyes again. "And clarity," she added, "is exactly what tonight is about to provide." Somewhere in the room, a glass tipped and shattered softly against the marble floor. No one moved to clean it up. Because the woman in the plain coat had not raised her voice, had not made demands, had not revealed her name, and yet every person present could feel the shape of the evening changing, rearranging itself around her, as though the room were slowly learning who it truly belonged to. No one bent to pick up the broken glass. The shards lay scattered across the marble like a quiet warning, something fractured that had once seemed solid, now impossible to ignore without risking a cut. A few guests glanced down, then away, instinctively stepping around it as though avoidance alone might undo what had already happened. The woman noticed. She always noticed what people refused to touch. She shifted her weight slightly, the movement subtle, grounding. "It's interesting," she said, almost thoughtfully, "how quickly confidence dissolves when certainty does." The man with the silver watch finally spoke again, though his voice was lower now, stripped of its earlier ease. "If you're suggesting influence," he said, "it would be unconventional." She met his gaze. "So was the internet," she replied. "So were derivatives. So was every idea that redefined who controlled the outcome." A few people swallowed. Someone near the windows folded their arms, defensive without knowing why. The host glanced toward the exits. Security stood where it always had, still smiling, still unaware that the room's problem was not something that could be escorted outside. The woman turned slowly, taking in the space once more. The chandeliers. The art on the walls, donations with names attached. The carefully curated impression of permanence. "You've mistaken visibility for stability," she said. "And attention for protection." The older man with the building named after him finally found his voice. "Why now?" he asked. "Why here?" That question carried something raw beneath it, not anger, not entitlement, but the faint echo of fear. She considered him for a long moment before answering. "Because moments like this," she said, "are when masks are worn most comfortably." People reveal more when they believe they're untouchable. She took a step closer to the center again, and this time no one questioned the movement. Space adjusted for her instinctively. I wanted to see, she continued, who would look away, who would laugh, and who would ask questions. Her eyes drifted, unhurried, across the faces that had earlier dismissed her. Some now avoided her gaze. Others held it too long, trying to reassert something already lost. And now that you've seen, the host asked quietly. A pause. She reached into her coat pocket, not hurried, not dramatic, and withdrew her phone. The screen lit her face faintly as she glanced down, thumb hovering just above the glass. I haven't decided yet, she said. Around her, breath caught. Somewhere, an assistant whispered a name, hers, but it was swallowed by the hush before it could travel. The woman looked up again, phone still in hand, eyes steady, as if weighing not power but preference, and the room waited, suspended in the fragile space between what had already changed and what was about to. The waiting stretched. It pressed into the corners of the room, into the pauses between breaths, into the delicate calculations happening behind composed faces. Time, usually so obedient to schedules and signals, had slowed to her pace. She lowered the phone slightly, not yet acting on whatever rested behind that darkened screen. Decisions made too quickly, she said, tend to favor whoever is loudest in the moment. Her gaze returned to the host. I prefer to listen first. The host nodded, though it was unclear whether he agreed or simply understood that resistance no longer served him. Then listen, he said, gesturing weakly to the room. This is a community built on trust. A few people shifted at the word trust. The woman smiled, not unkindly. Trust, she repeated, as if tasting it. Yes. That's usually what people call it when oversight becomes inconvenient. A restrained chuckle rippled from somewhere in the crowd, dying almost immediately when no one joined it. The woman didn't look toward the sound. She didn't need to. Tell me, she continued, addressing no one and everyone at once, when was the last time this room invited someone without first checking what they could offer? The question hovered, unanswered. She turned toward a small cluster near the bar. You, she said gently, indicating a woman whose necklace alone could have funded a small school. What did you assume when you saw me walk in? The woman stiffened, color rising in her cheeks. I didn't. It's all right, the simple woman said. You don't have to say it out loud. Most people don't. She moved on, her attention shifting like a slow tide. And you, she said to a man who had earlier laughed behind his glass. You mistook restraint for irrelevance. The man opened his mouth, then closed it again. Each quiet observation peeled something back. Not accusations, reflections. The kind that made denial difficult because they were accurate. The older patron took a step forward, tentative now. What is it you want from us? He asked again, more softly this time. She studied him, really studied him, then glanced at the phone once more. What I want, she said, depends on what you're willing to acknowledge, publicly, not privately. A murmur rose, quick and anxious. She lifted her eyes. Because the moment I speak my name, she added, this room will change permanently. The phone vibrated lightly in her hand. She didn't look down. Not yet. The vibration passed, and still she waited. A few people noticed. Fewer understood what it meant, that whatever was calling for her attention was not urgent to her, only to everyone else. Power, when genuine, was never in a hurry. The host drew a slow breath. If there's something you intend to reveal, he said carefully, this room would rather hear it from you than discover it elsewhere. She inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the calculation beneath his words. Of course, she replied. Control the moment, control the damage. A flicker of something, approval, perhaps, crossed her face. You've learned, she added. Some of you have. Her eyes moved again, settling briefly on a man near the back who had said nothing all evening. He stood very still, hands clasped, watching her not with fear but with recognition. When their gazes met, his expression tightened, just enough to betray that he understood exactly who, or what, stood before him. She filed that away. Reputations, she said, turning back to the room, are expensive things. You invest years building them, assuming they'll shield you when the structure underneath starts to fail. Several heads lowered now. Not in shame, strategists rarely felt shame, but in concentration. The kind that came when exits were being quietly evaluated. She stepped closer to the windows, the city lights reflecting faintly in her eyes. From up here, she continued, everything looks connected. Capital flows. Influence moves. Decisions made in rooms like this echo far beyond them. She paused, then added, that's why rooms like this matter. The host followed her line of sight. And tonight? He asked. Tonight, she said, is an audit. The word landed heavily. Phones buzzed again, more insistently this time. A few people stopped pretending and checked them openly. One man swore under his breath. Another smiled tightly, already preparing a version of himself that might survive what was coming. The woman finally glanced down at her screen. Just once. Her thumb hovered, then stilled. Interesting, she murmured, not to the room, but not entirely to herself either. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and turned around, her expression composed, unreadable. It seems, she said, that some of you have begun explaining yourselves without being asked. No one spoke. She looked from face to face, measuring reactions, recalibrating possibilities, deciding, perhaps, who would remain useful once the evening revealed its true cost. And still, she did not give her name. A faint smile touched her lips, the kind that never quite reached the eyes. That, she said softly, is usually how it starts. The host glanced around, noting how alliances were already shifting, people edging closer to some, away from others, recalculating proximity as if it were currency. Old friendships were being weighed against newer risks. In a matter of minutes, the room had become a living ledger. You should understand, the woman continued, I didn't orchestrate this evening. I simply allowed it. She stepped away from the windows and walked slowly through the crowd. Guests parted for her without thinking, an unconscious recognition of gravity. She stopped beside a man who had earlier boasted loudly about expansion plans, his voice now conspicuously absent. Your Southeast venture, she said casually. You should reconsider the timeline. His eyes widened. How do you? She raised a hand, not to silence him, but to pause the inevitability of the answer. You'll find the reason shortly, she said. Likely through someone you trust. She moved on before he could respond. Near the bar, two women whispered urgently, one nodding, the other pale. Somewhere else, a call was answered and abruptly ended. The room hummed with private reckonings. The older man exhaled slowly. This kind of leverage, he said, choosing the word carefully, invites retaliation. She stopped and turned to him. Only when it's used carelessly, she replied. I prefer sustainability. Her gaze softened, not with mercy, but with clarity. I've spent years watching people confuse dominance with permanence. They're not the same. The host stepped closer, lowering his voice. If you intend to restructure anything connected to this group, he said, we should speak before assumptions spiral. She studied him for a moment, then nodded once. We will, she said. But not yet. She glanced around again, as if committing the scene to memory. The shattered glass still lay on the floor, untouched, reflecting the chandeliers in broken fragments. She gestured toward it lightly. Leave it, she said. It's honest. Another vibration pulsed faintly from her pocket, longer this time. She ignored it again, focusing instead on the room, on the people who were finally seeing her not as she appeared, but as she functioned. This evening, she continued, will be discussed for years. Most of you will remember it differently. That's normal. She paused, then added, what matters is what you choose to do after you leave. The doors at the far end of the hall opened briefly as new guests arrived, laughter spilling in, unaware, unprepared, stepping into a space already altered. The woman turned slightly toward the sound, her expression thoughtful, as if considering how much further the ripple should travel, and who, exactly, would feel it next. She watched the newcomers for a moment, their easy smiles, their untroubled certainty, and then made her decision. The woman reached into her coat one final time and withdrew her phone. This time, she didn't ignore it. She tapped the screen once. Across the room, several devices chimed simultaneously. Then more. Then nearly all of them. The sound rolled through the hall like a sudden change in weather, sharp, unavoidable. Faces drained of color as messages loaded, as numbers aligned, as confirmations appeared from firms that did not make mistakes. The host's phone slipped from his hand. He didn't bend to pick it up. The older man stared at his screen for a long time before whispering, 750 million. The woman let the silence do the rest. My name, she said at last, her voice calm and unmistakably clear, won't matter to you for long. What will matter is that I now hold controlling interests in 12 of the entities represented in this room, directly or otherwise. No gasps. No protests. Just the quiet collapse of assumptions. I built my fortune where attention was scarce and patience was rewarded, she continued. While you were looking at one another, I was looking at systems. She turned to the host. This event, she said gently, was beautifully curated. I appreciate the invitation. He nodded stiffly, humbled beyond denial. She picked up her bag, plain as ever, and glanced once more at the shattered glass on the floor. Wealth, she added, reveals character far faster than poverty ever does. Then she walked toward the exit. No one stopped her. No one dared. As the doors closed behind her, the room erupted, not in chaos, but in urgent whispers, hurried calls, and the frantic reshaping of futures. Alliances would break before morning. Empires would quietly change hands. Stories would be rewritten to preserve dignity. But none of them would ever forget the moment they looked down on a simple woman. And discovered, too late, that she had been standing above them all along.